Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And this is our third episode in a series about the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and America's unique, strange, disturbing relationship with firearms. We finished the last episode in the late 1970s at a famous gathering held by the NRA in which the hardliners, the people who created the NRA of today, basically take over the organization.
Yeah, so this is a kind of internal coup led by a man named Harlan Carter. And it's this dramatic internal takeover. And they change the mission of the NRA, which, as we've been saying, until then had been a group focused on gun safety, which is an amazing thing for anybody who knows the NRA today to think about. And it's Carter who changes that. He holds that any regulation is basically a slippery slope to total disarmament. So if you try to say that people need a license or that they should, that you should have permits or that you should have background checks or waiting periods, any common sense gun control, he says, if you do that, the next thing you know, they're going to take all your guns away and you'll never, ever be able to carry a gun. And so he takes this absolute hardline approach. And he's reportedly the person who coined the phrase, guns don't kill people. People kill people. As we said last time, he's actually a convicted murderer, so he should know, as far as I'm concerned. So people kill people with guns, and it turns out that guns make it easier for people who want to kill people. And that is what Harlan Carter decides needs to happen, and he leads this charge with the NRA and reshapes it. So by the late 1970s, the NRA is a real political force in American life. And in particular, what they are peddling is a story about fear. And the fear can take different forms, but they say you should be afraid of rising crime. You should be afraid of social upheaval, the civil rights movements that we were talking about last time, David. You should be afraid of government tyranny. The government's coming for your guns. You should be afraid of all of these things. And because you should be afraid of your neighbor, because you should be afraid of, the person down the street, you need a gun to protect yourself. And that is the dominant discourse that shapes American society from the late 70s to now.
And that opposition to any regulation of guns, who buys them, what sort of guns people can own, that is a real break in American history. Because part of building this new NRA is to claim that gun control is somehow un-American and not part of American history, which involves rewriting American history.
And this is why recovering American history in the way that we've been doing in these episodes, David, excavating the actual history of guns in America is so important, because their whole political project depends on their rewriting the record. And as you say, saying that any kind of gun control is ahistorical, it's never happened, it's unconstitutional. And this is just historically, that is nonsense. It is just not the case. And it's very easily disproven, as we've been, I think, showing. So Carter takes over the NRA, not to be confused with Jimmy Carter, who is president at the same time.
I think most people have never heard of Harlan Carter, but he is a really consequential figure that leads us to where we are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So he was the former head of the Border Force, which was the version of ICE in the 1950s. And he actually led a movement within the Border Force called, and I apologize for the offensive language to Mexican listeners, but he led a mission called Operation Wetback. Which, of course, is...
It's a racial slur against Mexicans, yeah.
Yeah, saying that they cross the rivers. And anyway. But that was the official name, which gives you a sense of how racialized the border forces, kind of unapologetically racialized their approach was. And that was what Harlan Carter had led before he takes over the NRA. We said last time that his nickname as a kid was Bullet Head. He has this, bullet-shaped head. I actually think in pictures he looks a lot, and very ironically, like Nikita Khrushchev.
Not a good look in the Cold War.
He would have hated that. So that's one of the reasons I like making the association. He would not.
And he transforms the NRA, its finances and its membership.
Yeah. So the membership triples under his leadership to 3 million, and the budget suddenly explodes to $70 million, which, is a huge amount of money. And again, we need to remember that the NRA has always just been this kind of gun safety sports club. And suddenly it's a huge political lobby with a vast membership and a huge budget at its disposal. And as we said last time, it starts spending that budget to support its new interpretation of the Second Amendment to say that it is an absolute individual right.
So 3 years after Harlan Carter takes over, we get the Reagan administration.
Yeah.
And they're dealing with an NRA completely unlike the historic NRA that's now long gone.
The political class in America has to kind of remake their relationship to the NRA, this new thing that is lobbying and throwing money into the political system to shape the outcomes, to shape the debate. And the fact is, though, is that gun regulation has by no means just kind of disappeared just because the NRA is now taking a hardline position. It's going to take them a long time to achieve that. And there are key events that intervene, including the attempted assassination of Reagan in 1981, when John Hinckley Jr. shoots Reagan, but of course he survived, and his press secretary was shot at the same time. And there was, as there historically has been in response to political assassination attempts in America, a response of bipartisan gun control. It brought urgency back to that debate.
So there was a moment of backlash after the attempted assassination of President Reagan, when even though the NRA is a more powerful, more political organization, when there was another push for gun control and against the NRA.
And it worked. Reagan's press secretary was also shot. It gave his name to a landmark gun control bill that was passed in response to this. So there was still bipartisan support for gun control, and it could still have overwhelming popular support. In fact, Americans have historically supported gun control, as we'll talk about at the end of our story. That same year, when Reagan was shot, actually Harlan Carter's past resurfaces. The story comes out that he was, in fact, a convicted killer. But the gun movement just shrugs. They do not care that the new head of this is a man convicted of killing in cold blood. And they just move on.
He stays in office.
He stays in office. He's still running the NRA. Nobody seems to mind. Well, some people minded, but not enough to change the membership or to change the outcome. There were, of course, people resigning from the NRA in protest over this change. In fact, my grandfather was one of them. But as I say, not enough to actually change the outcome.
The 1980s and 1990s is a period when many countries around the world look at gun ownership and stricter rules are imposed. And it's because of a series of mass shootings. And in America, it's in that decade that we get the first of a phenomena, which it's still, I find astonishing that we have a word for it. Because it's so common, we get the first school shooting.
Or that we have a word for it, or that there are any debates about it. The idea that you would debate whether it's okay to have a school shooting. So yeah, this is sometimes called the first school shooting. I'm not going to make an absolute claim that there was never a shooting at a school before, but it's that modern phenomenon that you're referring to, David. And that was in 1988. And as it happens, it was in my hometown, a little village outside of Chicago called Winnetka, Illinois. And there's a very small primary school there, what we call the grade school, called Hubbard Woods. And a woman, it was actually a rare case of a woman mass shooter in this instance. She went into a classroom and opened fire on a second grade classroom. So that's like 7, 8-year-olds. And she killed a child, wounded 6 others. And yeah, as you say, that's sometimes now called the school shooting. It's a story that I have a really strong connection to because my little brother was in the 4th grade at that school. He was 9 years old. He was in the class of her intended victims. And he still lives there, and his kids now go to school, and he's now dealing with the changes in gun laws. So we're looking at people who have multi-generational relationship to school shootings.
And this is a suburb of Chicago, and this history collides with your own family at this moment in 1988.
Yeah, it does. But the thing is that at that time, it was really unusual. It would have been so hard for me to find anybody else who knew what it felt like to wonder if your little brother was lying dead when he was supposed to be learning his multiplication tables. And I can't tell you what that feels like. But millions of Americans now know what that feels like.
You were, what, 17, 18 at the time?
Yeah, he was my baby brother. And of course, you don't have cell phones. We were getting the news from radio. I was home from my first year of college on summer vacation. And I was working in a bookstore, of course. I'll surprise everybody that was my summer job, was in a bookstore. I was a very consistent kind of a geek. So people were coming into the bookstore and telling us, what had happened. The rumors were flying around, and there were rumors that she'd set fire to the school, which in fact she tried to set fire to a different school. And nobody knew what was happening. But we knew that she was targeting that school. And so you're just sitting there wondering if your 8-year-old little brother has been shot. And as I say, at that time, that was something that it wasn't a common experience. And now, of course, it is all too common. And children know what's happening. They text their parents to say they love them when they're 7 years old. The point of dwelling on this one is not just because I had a personal experience of it or because my little brother was involved in it, but to say that it was so unexpected. It was such a shock. It was not the norm. We didn't have active shooter drills. Kids weren't learning how to deal with, guns in schools because things hadn't changed yet. But this is the beginning of that change. And so what happened was that the village passed strict gun laws in response. They said she was an unwell individual. How did she get a hold of these guns? They passed stricter gun laws. And that was a kind of normal response, right? And then over the next 10 years, there are a series of other mass shootings. And at the same time, there's a new leader in the NRA. So Harlan Carter is out of the picture, and a guy named Wayne LaPierre has taken over the NRA leadership in 1991. He ran the NRA until last year. He was the president until 2024. So again, a very, very influential figure. And he oversees this kind of politicization of the NRA.
And he pushes very hard on the NRA's interpretation of the Second Amendment being about individual rights to own guns rather than militias and national security.
Yeah. And this becomes increasingly a kind of GOP orthodoxy. The Republicans start to really align themselves with this position. The NRA is supporting the politicians who will, support their interpretation. And by support, we mean, of course, pay for. They're giving money to campaigns that will support them.
And this is going to be a key method that they're going to use: financing campaigns, raising money for candidates, paying for attack ads against candidates who propose even modest gun control laws.
Yeah. So gun control rapidly becomes a political liability for Democrats. And very quickly it becomes orthodoxy over the course of the 90s, really, that the Democrats are pro-gun control, but they are weak. Not only weak, the NRA position would be that the Democrats are weak on guns, but the orthodoxy becomes that they're weak on gun control. Like, they're very feeble about it. They don't fight that hard for it because they start to see it as politically toxic. And at the same time, the idea that the GOP supports gun rights becomes absolutely political orthodoxy. And it's over the 90s that this bipartisan consensus that we had starts to collapse because people are seen to be losing elections if they support gun control. So it seems politically toxic to take that position.
You're going to lose your run for the House or Congress or for a state position if you support gun control. But at the same time, what's also happening, and this happens repeatedly in this story, is that the technology of firearms is advancing. We have a law, the Second Amendment, passed for smoothbore muskets in the last years of the 18th century. Weapons are becoming far more dangerous with the advent of assault weapons.
And assault weapons start to change the scene, not only in the US, of course, but also around the world. So over the course of the mid to late 90s, you see a series of mass shootings, not only in America. Now, the one in America, the turning point, is the big school shooting that most people will have heard of, unlike the little one in the town where I grew up, which of course is Columbine in 1999, when 13 students and teachers were killed at a Colorado high school. And it was followed by no meaningful gun action because by that point, by 1999, after 20 years of political lobbying, the NRA had successfully stymied gun regulation as a response to a mass shooting.
And you have to contrast the reaction in America to the high school shootings of the 1990s, particularly Columbine, with what is happening around the world. Because as British listeners will know, there was also a terrible school shooting in Britain in the 1919 in the Scottish town of Dunblane. A lone gunman in his 40s killed 16 children and their teachers. The worst mass shooting in British history. And that leads to a commission, and it leads to new laws that effectively completely outlaw handguns in Britain. There's another event in 1996 in Tasmania in a place called Port Arthur, which is a terrible massacre. And that leads to new gun laws in Australia. 640,000 firearms were handed in after those laws were passed. So there are countries in the 1990s who go through events like this when high-powered weapons are used against civilians, against children. And it leads almost automatically to people going, we've got to stop this. Guns have got to be controlled. These sorts of weapons can't be in the hands of private citizens. It doesn't happen in the United States, despite events like Columbine, in large part because the NRA is now the political organization that we know.
Yeah. So the NRA is funding a response that thwarts any attempt to have that kind of common sense, sane response. And that's when we start to get, as you say, this phenomenon of the school shooting, that becomes a thing that this society is prepared to put up with. After Columbine, the NRA doubles down. Instead of saying, oh, we got this wrong, this is terrible, people are dying, we need to rein it in, you have Charlton Heston, who by that point is the figurehead kind of president of the NRA. There's a famous moment at the 2000 NRA convention where he famously says that they will have to wrest his guns from his cold, dead hands, right? So these defiant statements of absolute right to have guns, even if it leads to the slaughter of innocent children. That's effectively been the position ever since.
Because there is now a depressingly long list of school shootings that we could go through from Columbine to the present day. And they've all in some ways been met by the same arguments that gun rights is an absolute individual right protected by the Second Amendment or their interpretation of the Second Amendment. And there's no give on that. This is an absolute position.
Yeah. But what happens that's really important and that will change the landscape is that at the same time, this funding that the NRA has been doing has not just been shaping what politicians are and are not willing to do, but they've also been shaping the courts. What they have been doing is funding lawyers and legal studies and lawsuits and positions that will create the legal possibility and the interpretation in the courts of the Second Amendment in the ways that they want to see. And what happens is that in the 10 years after Columbine, that starts to bear fruit, that starts to really take hold. So the Roberts Court, the Supreme Court, and remember, Roberts is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court now. So we are now talking about the Supreme Court. It's not the exact same membership because some of them have died and been replaced, but it's the Roberts Court. And that's what we are looking at right now. And since 2008, so over the last 17 years, the Roberts Court has been actively reshaping American gun law, where we saw in the 1930s, the Supreme Court upheld Congress and said, yes, federal firearms law makes sense. The Second Amendment says nothing about the right to have a sawed-off shotgun if you're going to be a bank robber. That's not what the Second Amendment is about. And that militia theory that we've been talking about held sway. What happens is the Roberts Court takes what had been the NRA fringe view that it was an absolute individual right, and they make it law. So in 2008, they issue an incredibly consequential decision, technically District of Columbia v. Heller. It's just known as Heller. And the Heller decision overturns those 200 years that we've been talking about of that militia theory understanding and says it has nothing to do with militias. It says the words well-regulated don't have anything to do with it. They rule that it is merely introductory, like Madison was clearing his throat. Like it just went, well-regulated militia, but it doesn't mean anything. And they said it doesn't limit the core right itself. So they take out the foundational logic of the amendment. And then that's a local overturning in 2008 in DC. And then 2 years later, they make it national. So they apply the same logic in a decision called McDonald versus Chicago.
And the effects of that are that cities that have passed gun control laws can have those laws stripped
Yeah, they're struck down. So they are overturned by the Supreme Court. So if you are a local, you're trying to just be a sensible person in a village or city locally, and you say, well, we're going to pass some gun safety laws. Everybody around us supports them. And the Supreme Court is intervening, striking those laws down and saying that they are unconstitutional. So they start blocking local gun restrictions, not just federal ones. And what they're doing then is making this NRA fringe reinterpretation of the Second Amendment. It becomes the law of the land as of 2010.
Let's take a break there and come back to discover how gun ownership increased, how the number of guns in America escalated enormously as we get into the 21st century, and also discover where the NRA is today. Welcome back to Journey Through Time. Sarah, in 2008, Barack Obama is elected as America's first African-American president. And there is an immediate backlash in relation to guns and gun rights.
Yeah. So many listeners will remember that a political movement arose in response to Obama's presidency called the Tea Party. And the Tea Party was the kind of forerunner of the modern GOP.
The grand old party, the Republicans.
Yeah, sorry, the Republican Party. But the Tea Party, like what they call the America Caucus now, or the Freedom Caucus, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Josh Hawley, and figures that people who are following American politics today will recognize. These are people where their kind of politics are grounded in an anti-government rage. And they go into government to dismantle the government, the federal government. And they say they want everything to be done on the local level, except that they really don't, because it's all inconsistent. But anyway, their gun rights ideology is part of that. So there have been studies that have shown that actually hostility toward Obama was the single strongest predictor of being a member of the Tea Party in 2009, 2010, when they dominated the midterms after Obama's election, and they took Congress away from the Democrats and kind of led to, as I say, the modern form of the Republican Party that we know today.
This is in the midterm elections of 2010 when the House and Congress turns Republican.
Correct.
At the same time, during the 8 years of the Obama presidency, there is a huge upsurge in gun sales and in the production of guns in America. The gun industry increased 158% by 2016. People felt the need to buy guns in this moment for the darkest of reasons.
It's very hard not to see this as an extension of the story of civil rights that we were talking about last time, isn't it, David? I mean, you have to work really hard to see the election of the first Black president and a surge in gun ownership as being totally distinct from the response in the South, the rise of white militias in the South after the Civil War, and then the backlash of racial violence in the 60s, and the way that contributed to this changing interpretation of the Second Amendment. And again, it's this anti-government rage. So there were people who saw Obama as an illegitimate president.
This is the age of birtherism as well, so pretending he was born in Kenya.
Yeah. And of course, that was very much promulgated by the current president, Donald Trump, who launched his political career on the back of that conspiracy of saying that Obama wasn't really American. He was an illegitimate president, therefore. And so that anti-government rage that people have been told the Second Amendment is there to protect, to keep them from having to submit to an illegitimate authority. Well, if you're already predisposed to see a Black leader as illegitimate, and you've been told he's not really American, and he's a Muslim, and he's a foreigner, and he's all of these things, then the rise in gun ownership can only look ominous in that context.
As well as a rise in gun ownership, there is a rise in gun violence and mass shootings in particular.
Yeah. So they're correlated, of course, and the violence escalates over this period. So listeners will be familiar with it. Everybody listens to the news. They know the school shootings and the other mass shootings in America, but we'll just, mention a few so that people remind themselves of the kind of things that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's a depressing list.
It's a very depressing list, but it's important that we understand, where this comes from. And to me, the thing that makes it not depressing, David, and we can talk about this when we finish our story, but is that if we understand that this was made, we understand how it can be unmade. It has not always been this way. And that to me is where the hope comes in. It's so important that we understand that it has not always been this way. And therefore it can be changed. But at the moment, yes, we're looking at a period over the last 15 years of escalating gun violence. So Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was shot at an event in 2011. She survived, I'm happy to say, and she became a leading voice for gun reform. As I've noted before, people who survive gun violence in America have a strong tendency to become advocates for gun reform. And of course, soon after Gabby Giffords came the terrible shooting at Sandy Hook in 2012, when 20 small children and 6 staff were killed. And the country was absolutely grief-stricken. And people called for change, but Congress did nothing. And even the attempt to pass a modest background check bill, a tiny bit of intervention, failed in 2013. And it's important to say that that failed despite overwhelming support, not only from the public at large, but also from gun owners. It was supported, and it still didn't pass Congress.
I think it's important to remember that throughout this period, the majority of Americans support gun control laws, which have been a part of American life since before the revolution. So it is an historical norm, and it is also favored by the majority of Americans. And yet, even after events like Sandy Hook, and the list goes on, Aurora, Charleston, San Bernardino, the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016, after each of these events, there is a campaign, there is a surge of outrage and disgust. And at each time, the NRA uses its political power and its financial power to prevent meaningful legislation being passed. And this is under the figure we mentioned earlier, Wayne LaPierre.
Yeah. So LaPierre has a slogan. We were talking about Carter's slogan last time, who said, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Harlan Carter, not Jimmy Carter, but Wayne LaPierre, his slogan is one that will be familiar to people following gun violence in America. He's the one who said, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. This is not true. I just want to come in on the basis of truth and point out that there are things that stop bad guys with guns other than good guys with guns. We can show this all over the world, that there are other things that stop bad guys with guns, like keeping guns out of their hands.
Exactly, because the reason the bad guy is so lethal is because he has a gun.
Because you gave him a gun. Don't give him a gun, you know?
There's basic medical statistics, like we know that you are 5 times more likely to die from a gun wound than a stab wound. The lethality of American life, at its core of it, is this bizarre, aberrant relationship to firearms that the rest of the world struggles to understand.
Yeah, just doesn't have, right? And there's so much statistical information about the correlation between high numbers of gun ownership and high numbers, high amounts of gun violence. But for the Americans who deny it, part of what enables them to deny it is that the NRA has been actively suppressing studies of gun violence in America. So that's one of their interventions as well, is they made sure that there were no studies at the federal level of the gun violence. People have had to start doing that on their own because the government wasn't doing it. So individuals have been creating trackers of gun violence, statistics and studies of gun violence in America, but there have been no official federal studies of it because the NRA stopped that from happening.
That slogan by Wayne LaPierre, that it's about bad guys, not about guns, I mean, that comes in a long trajectory of the NRA finding an argument that the problem is anything but guns. Mm-hmm. In the 1980s, it was violent movies. In the 1990s, it was violent video games. It is always something. It's a bad guy. It's what they're watching. It's the game they're playing. It is never the gun itself.
Yeah. I think it was in Michigan. Listeners will correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a law that was passed a couple of years ago where a school outlawed backpacks because a student had been found with a gun in the backpack. So they outlawed the backpack as if that was the cause of the violence in America. They are literally saying it's about where the doors are. They're literally calling for teachers to be armed. And it's so irrational to anybody standing outside of that discourse to say that the thing that is endangering children is backpacks. It is irrational. And yet that is the level of the current debate.
The other key strategy of the NRA since the 70s has been financing political campaigns, and they put a lot of money into the campaign of Donald Trump.
They spent a staggering, reported, $76 million to help elect Donald Trump.
Back in 2016.
In 2016 for Trump's first election. And of course, this is one of the other things that differentiates American politics in this period, both from American politics historically and also from politics around the world is that currently, because of another Supreme Court decision called Citizens United, we have basically unlimited funds that can be put into campaigns by special interest groups like the NRA, paying $76 million to get Trump elected, reportedly its largest political investment ever. And Trump, unsurprisingly, therefore, had a very strong association with the NRA as a result of that. They bought his position.
Yeah. He famously spoke at their conventions more than any other president.
Yeah.
And gun rights were part of his message and his appeal to his base.
Yeah, essential to it, right? So very much supporting that Charlton Heston, you'll pull my guns out of my cold, dead hands. And it was later, allegations anyway, have revealed that not only did they give him $75 million that they were allowed to give, believe it or not, but also that there was $25 million, over $25 million in illegally coordinated ad spending, so that the NRA was, you'll be amazed to hear, breaking the law in its support of Trump as well. Now, one of the ironies of their support of Trump is that gun sales dropped after Trump was elected because of what you were saying about Obama, David, right?
There was an Obama boom where people rushed out to buy guns in unprecedented numbers. There was a slump, a Trump slump.
A Trump slump, because they were buying guns against what they perceived to be the threat of the Obama presidency, and the threat of a Democratic president taking away their guns is what they perceive to be the threat. And then under a Republican president who they know loves guns and will never allow gun legislation to pass, then they don't buy guns because there's no panic buying if you're not worried that you're going to lose them. So the NRA actually lost its bet, which is one of the little moments in here where we can find a bit of, justice. I don't know. It's a little bit of poetry or something, poetic justice.
And throughout the first Trump term, any efforts to pass even minor gun control laws are thwarted again by the NRA.
And there are a couple of very devastating mass shootings. During Trump's first term, the shooting at Las Vegas in 2017, which is still the deadliest U.S. shooting in American history. And then that was followed rapidly by the school shooting at Parkland in Florida, where 17 people were killed, most of them teenagers. In response to these, again, we see these national reform movements. We see political activists rise, but the political culture is such that it doesn't gain enough traction, although we're starting to see little changes locally, but we'll have to see if those can get anywhere. But what happens at this point is the story for the NRA starts to change a little bit. By 2018, the NRA is in trouble. They have been losing revenue, as we've said. They've been increasing their borrowing, and investigations begin into their activities. And it turns out that under the leadership of LaPierre, they have been engaged in all kinds of fraudulent spending, and they've been accused of all kinds of financial irregularities and of spending their lavish fundraising on themselves. And they've been, traveling around in private jets and whatever. So the NRA is starting to get into trouble, but the movement that they've supported by this point has taken on a life of its own.
Because we're now in the decade we're living in at this moment. We're in the 2020s, and this has been a disastrous decade for gun violence in the United States.
Yeah. So mass shootings have surged in the last 5 years. In 2021, there were 689 mass shootings. That's defined as a shooting of 4 or more, I believe.
The fact that there's a definition of mass shooting, as well as the fact that we have the phrase school shooting, the fact that we actually have these terms speaks to the insanity of this.
Yeah. And overall gun violence continues to rise sharply because, of course, we've been talking about mass shootings because they are the most horrific, but individual gun violence is also off the charts in the US, and more people die from individual gun violence than they do from mass shootings. The picture together, of course, is catastrophic.
We should also probably say that guns do something else which almost never gets into the headlines, which is that they enable an epidemic of suicide. That more than half the gun deaths are gun owners turning their guns on themselves. The lethality of American life is accentuated because at people's desperate moments, they have the most deadly firearms ever created in human history, literally in their homes.
And of course, there's a very high rate of accidental gun death as well. It's not all deliberate violence. There's so many.
Which is what the NRA was invented to prevent.
Was to prevent.
This is the irony.
Yeah, exactly. There are so many really deep ironies in this story, and that's one of them. We talk about unintended consequences on Journey Through Time, a lot, and this is a big one. They set out to create gun safety, and now the organization that was created to foster that has created a situation where toddlers are picking up guns from their parents' house and shooting themselves or their siblings. And everybody has seen these headlines, these terrible, terrible stories where accident has also led to violent gun deaths. So the overall picture is really devastating. But this is, again, why I think it's so important that we understand how it came about so that we can understand more clearly how it is that we might be able to reverse it and what it might take.
The other irony, of course, is that in the 2020s, we've seen a return to an aspect of American history which is at the center of the story of guns, which is the idea of militias.
Yeah. So there's been a rise in self-styled militias, far-right militias, paramilitary groups, which have gained ground under Trumpism, but they began under Obama for exactly the reasons that you alluded to earlier, David. This backlash against the first Black president, belief in his illegitimacy and birtherism, it gives rise to these groups, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Proud Boys, and they frame themselves as the armed guardians of real America, of true American identity, which, of course, is, as we've been saying, is deeply rooted in these histories of white nationalist grievance and this history of anti-government violence or anti-government suspicion. And of course, those three militias, all three of them, Oath Keepers, Three Presenters, Proud Boys, and others, all took part in the Capitol attack on January 6th, 2021, because they have been supported in this anti-government message. And in particular, under Trump, who famously, told the Proud Boys to stand by and has supported them in lots of other ways, they've enabled this militia to gain political traction instead of working as they did in 1871 to shut them down.
Yeah. It's a total distortion of the idea of militia. The Second Amendment's mention of militia is about the safety of this new republic. It's about external enemies. It's not about a militia to defend the individual right to own guns. So it is a complete misrepresentation of American history, but then that's at the heart of this story.
And indeed, it's not about your right to overthrow your government. I mean, no government is going to say the thing that we're going to do is make sure that you have a chance to overthrow us legally if that's what you want to do. So that's not what the Constitution says. But the NRA is going to continue to support this kind of messaging, right? To say that this is about protecting citizens from tyranny and their right to stand up against an illegitimate government if that is their choice. And of course, that is the logic and the defense of January 6th. Now, the other thing that we haven't said about gun ownership that's really important is that many people will be familiar with the statistic that there are more guns than there are people in the US and those kinds of numbers, but they are owned by a decreasing number of households and individuals. So there are more and more guns, but they're concentrated in fewer and fewer hands.
So the statistics are that 3% of Americans own half of the guns in circulation.
And 40% of the total gun stock in America is owned by the 8% of the country who have 10 or more firearms. That's 40% of it, right? So the idea that some people have outside of the US that literally every American is wandering around with AR-15s because that's what it means to have more guns than people, that's not the case. There are fewer and fewer people owning the guns, but those people who own them own more and more. So we were talking about how the Supreme Court has also shaped this. And there's a really important decision that they made just 3 years ago, which is called the Bruen decision. And the Bruen decision overturned a 100-year-old law in New York that said that you needed to have a good reason to carry a concealed weapon. Now, again, in most parts of the world, we might think that was a perfectly sensible law. And this one had been in place since 1911, but the Supreme Court struck it down. And they said that they were introducing a new test, which is called the history and tradition test. And what this says is that you have to find a logic for your modern laws in a historical analog, like a historical past. So basically, what they say is that if you can't show that something like this law existed in the 18th or 19th century, then you can't pass it. So it's like trying to regulate cars using laws that were written for horses and buggies. It's basically like saying you can only say that you can't drive fast if you can find a law that showed that carriages couldn't go too fast. And then you can say that cars can't go too fast, but you can't mandate headlamps unless you can show that horses and carriages had to have lanterns, right? This is the logic that they've brought into gun law in America since 2022. And what it means in effect is what is called constitutional carry. And constitutional carry means that there is no permit required to carry any kind of weapon, whether you're carrying it openly or concealed. You have a constitutional right to carry a gun. End of discussion.
So there's nothing a town can do, even in the aftermath of a terrible school shooting, to prevent people carrying concealed handguns because of this change to the law.
Because of this law 3 years ago.
Irrespective of your feelings, irrespective of what happened, irrespective how much support there might be in your local government, you have no rights. This is an absolute right that can't be messed with.
That's it. And so this is this very activist Supreme Court that is reaching into American political life and into the legal system and changing things. They are acting as legislators. They're writing laws. They're determining what kind of laws can be written. And they are radically, dramatically changing the understanding of gun law in America. And constitutional carry has spread like wildfire since 2022. It's now law in half the country in 3 years. So people they can just carry a gun if they want to.
So it's no longer really about the NRA. The NRA in some ways has done its work, and this absolutist position has now spread to organizations that are even more extreme than the NRA, as well as to the legislative and the judicial branch of the US government.
Yeah. As you say, the NRA, I mean, we were talking a minute ago about how it has been collapsing basically since 2018. Wayne LaPierre got removed last year. It has all kinds of internal fighting going on, but it doesn't matter anymore. As you say, its work is now done. It has successfully made guns ideological. It has successfully transformed Americans' ideas about guns into thinking they don't have anything to do with sport or hunting. They're entirely about identity. They're about politics. They're about self-defense. They're about this idea of resisting tyranny. They're about ideas, and they've become a symbol of liberty. And that is the change that we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years as the power to define gun law has shifted from lawmakers to the courts.
It's also become part of a more general militarization of American life in all sorts of ways. And I think the most striking way to us in 2025 is ICE and their agents with their masks and their military-grade weapons, unmarked vehicles, plucking people off the streets.
And they carry no badges. There was just a court case as we're recording this where they refused to give their names in court, and the judge was like, okay, so they're being given total anonymity, and they are, as you say, they are carrying these militarized weapons. And as people have rightly pointed out, because they have no badges and they don't have to identify themselves and they're masking their faces, any criminal who gets a hold of a gun can declare himself an ICE agent and abduct people off the streets with impunity. It's a secret police. They have created a secret police that has blurred this boundary between civilians, police forces, and paramilitary forces. And now you can't tell the difference. The armed citizen is becoming the police state.
And we got here in part because of a distortion and a misrepresentation of American history.
This is it, right? It couldn't have been done without this distortion of American history and rewriting it, chopping out, as you said, expunging the record, chopping out the first half of the Second Amendment and pretending that Madison didn't really mean it.
And plucking out of famous moments in American history, like the gunfight at the OK Corral in the 1880s, and missing out the key bit of that story, which is it was about gun control. The gunfight took place because the local police wanted to take the guns off people according to a local ordinance.
Or people still talk about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It's this legendary shootout, and nobody stops to say, well, hang on, that was 7 professional criminals, and the country called it a massacre, and they were shocked. What does that tell you about attitudes to gun crime in 1929 versus today?
That a government 90 years ago could pass a law banning machine guns that is still in effect today. You cannot buy a Thompson submachine gun, but you can buy an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. It speaks to the fact that America could do this, and America always has done this, controlled guns. But you need to create an alternative version of American history in which gun laws are against the spirit of the American Republic, an insult to the ideals of the revolution. And to do that, you need to erase a hell of a lot of history.
Yeah. So what's really interesting about the Bruen decision, from my point of view...
This was in 2020.
This is the 2022 decision that brings in... It was written by Justice Clarence Thomas, and He was the author. It's a 5-4 majority decision, but he's the author of the opinion.
So he brought this opinion to the other members of the Supreme Court.
Well, he writes up their opinion. So they convene, they argue, they debate, they vote, they agree what their position is, and then they assign one person to write the opinion that will go public and say, this is what the 5 members who voted for this agree. This is what we think is the case. And the reason I mention it here is because what he did was he introduced, as I said, this thing called the history and tradition test. What it means is that judges have to act like historians. They have to go back to 19th century and 18th century records and ascertain what it was that was happening, what it meant, what the context was. Now, what that means in practice right now is that they're plucking things out of context and using them with no historical understanding whatsoever. They're cherry picking from history. It's turning them into very bad historians. But what some people are calling for, which I think is really, really interesting, is that the campaigns to try to pass gun legislation under this Bruin opinion will need to rely on expert witnesses who are historians. That what they need to do, that lawyers need to start bringing historians into the courtroom and saying, you've got this wrong, and here's why, and here's how this works. And so they need to be bringing in some of our colleagues who are experts on colonial American and revolutionary American history, bring in people like Joanne Freeman, bring in people like Joe Lepore into the courts to say that's not what that means. And here's how we know that's not what that means.
So we could see historians in court in these decisions pointing out that gun control is a feature of American society all the way back to and before the revolution. We could see historians as expert witnesses trying to get us out of the place the NRA has got us into.
Yeah. And, what's interesting from my point of view is that it isn't historians who are calling for that. You might think, well, of course we would think that was a good idea. But it's actually legal writers, legal observers who are saying, actually, this might be one of the ways through this. What it speaks to, David, I think that for us is so foundational to what we're hoping to do in our conversations on the show is just about how empowering it is to understand history properly. It can be so confusing and bewildering and brutalizing when you're looking at something and you can't understand how did it get this way. It just feels insane. Now, as we've been saying, in a lot of ways, the American position on guns is irrational. I mean, I absolutely take that position, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. If we understand how it developed, as they say, at least we have some chances of trying to figure out how to reverse it. I mean, once you have an ideological position like this that is deeply held by a vast number of your citizens, it's hard. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we can, that a few historians go to court and this will all change. Obviously, that would be folly. But it does speak to how important it is that we study our own history, that we understand our own history, and that we understand how our politics and our culture comes out of that history so that we aren't just kind of being, as far as I'm concerned, Americans were manipulated by the NRA, and you're much less subject to that manipulation, to that propaganda, if you understand what the actual history is.
Yeah, if you can look back at previous American presidents, previous American Congresses passing gun laws in reaction to outrages or massacres on the street, if you look back to the periods of American history like the Old West that are the most mythologized and see that within that mythology, behind the gunslingers and the shootouts, are gun laws that we seem incapable of even contemplating today, that it is there. In some ways, history has the answer because we have done this before and we could therefore do it again.
And that's beautifully put, David. History has the answer. I think that's the perfect note on which to close this. I hope that people found it enlightening and elucidating. Even if we don't have all of the answers, we can point in the direction of history and get some of them. So thank you very much for listening and hope to see you again.
Sarah, thank you very much. I've learned loads. It's been fascinating.
Thanks. See you later.
Thanks for listening.